As rain poured down on a desolate country road, a broke teenage boy noticed a woman in a torn wedding dress sobbing beside her car, stranded and alone. He offered help with nothing to give, but what she gave back changed his life forever. Like heartwarming stories with twists of fate, hit like and subscribe so you never miss a tearjerker with a happy ending. Ooh. Jason's hands were always dirty. They bore the stains of engine oil and bike chain grease, of rusted screws and cracked wrenches, of the kind of labor most boys his age would avoid, like homework. His fingers were rough with calluses, and his nails never came clean, no matter how much his mother scrubbed them with a nail brush she kept by the sink. He didn't mind. There was a quiet comfort in fixing things. When bolts clicked into place and engines purred to life, it gave him a feeling he couldn't get anywhere else. Something about making broken things work again gave his days meaning. The August air clung to his skin like damp laundry, heavy with the scent of rain that hadn't fallen yet but promised it would. The sky was swollen with clouds, deepening from a steel gray to something darker, more impatient. Jason adjusted the strap of his worn backpack and pulled the hood of his jacket tighter around his face, even though it was still warm out. He had walked the long way home, skirting the main road because a fallen tree had blocked it earlier that morning. It added 40 minutes to his route, but Jason didn't complain. Complaining wasn't a luxury he could afford. His boots slapped against the wet gravel, soles thin from years of wear. Water had seeped in hours ago during his shift at the gas station, and now his socks were cold and squelching with every step. The wind picked up as he passed a row of cornfields, the stalks tall and shivering with each gust, hissing softly like whispers in the dusk. He was hungry. He always was. His last meal had been a half-stale peanut butter sandwich from the station's vending machine, and a free coffee his boss had looked the other way on. That had been around noon. It was now nearly 7. He reached into his pocket and fingered the loose change there. 73 cents. Not enough for a bus, even if one passed this far out, which it didn't. Not enough for anything, really. Jason sighed and looked up at the road ahead. It stretched quiet and empty before him, disappearing into a blur of trees and shadow. The rain was coming. He could feel it in his knees, in the way the air buzzed against his skin. He walked faster, but his limbs were already tired from the shift and the hours of standing on concrete under flickering fluorescent lights. A car passed him going the other way, headlights carving through the dusk like twin suns. Jason shielded his eyes briefly, then watched as the taillights disappeared into the curve behind him. He wondered where they were headed, probably somewhere dry, somewhere warm, maybe with dinner on a table. A real table with chairs that didn't wobble and a kitchen that didn't leak when it rained. He shook the thought from his head. Envy was another thing he couldn't afford. His mom would be waiting at home, maybe on the couch with her feet tucked under her, still in her nurse's scrubs. She'd been picking up double shifts lately to try and catch up on rent. They'd fallen behind when the fridge broke and had to be replaced. Jason had tried to fix it, but the compressor was beyond repair, and they didn't have the tools, or the parts, or the time. His stomach growled again, louder this time, and he put a hand over it as if to muffle the sound. He was rounding a bend in the road when he saw it. A car pulled over just ahead. Its hazard lights blinked weakly, one of them half dead and flickering like a dying firefly. The car was white and newer looking, foreign, a sedan with tinted windows. As he drew closer, he noticed the rear passenger side tire was completely flat, the rubber shredded in places like it had been driven on too long after bursting. At first, he thought the car was empty. The windows were fogged slightly from the humidity, but then he saw movement inside, a figure in the driver's seat, hunched forward, shoulders trembling. Jason slowed his pace. The woman inside had her face buried in her hands. Even through the glass and gathering mist, he could tell she was crying. The kind of crying that came from deep in the chest. Not the quiet kind. The kind that left your face blotchy and your breathing ragged and your heart wrung out like a dishcloth. Jason hesitated. Most people would have kept walking. You didn't get involved in other people's messes out here, especially not this far from town. It wasn't safe. It wasn't smart. But Jason didn't move on. He couldn't. Something about the Imagine woman in what looked like a wedding dress, alone on the side of a road with a blown tire and mascara running down her cheeks, planted his feet in the dirt. He approached slowly, hands visible, trying not to startle her. The window rolled down a fraction as he neared, just enough for him to hear her voice. It was hoarse and low, broken from crying. "I don't need help," she said, though her voice betrayed her. "I think your tire might disagree," Jason said gently. She turned toward him, and even in the dim light he could see her face, streaked with tears and framed by the frayed edges of a lace veil. Her lipstick was smeared, her eyes were red. She looked like a ghost of something once beautiful, now unraveling in the humid twilight. Jason stepped back slightly, giving her space. "I've got tools," he said, nodding to his backpack. "I can fix it if you want. You don't have to get out or anything." She stared at him, blinking as if trying to decide whether he was real. After a pause that felt longer than it probably was, she nodded once and reached across to unlock the passenger door. Jason walked around, opened it, and retrieved the jack from the trunk. She didn't speak again, just watched him as he crouched beside the car and set to work. The first drops of rain began to fall as he loosened the lug nuts, fat and cold, against the back of his neck. He worked quickly but carefully, muscles aching but precise. He didn't look up until the spare was in place and the ruined tire was in the trunk. By then, the rain had found its rhythm, falling in a steady whisper over the trees and grass. Jason stood, brushing his hands off on his jeans. He was soaked now, his jacket clinging to him, curls plastered to his forehead. He gave her a small smile. "You're good to go," he said. "Just don't drive too far on that spare." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her voice was thick with emotion when she finally spoke. "I don't have anything to give you." Jason shook his head. "That's okay," he said, stepping back into the road. "Just get home safe." And with that, he turned, hands back in his pockets, water streaming down his back as he walked into the falling night. He didn't look back. Not even once. The car's interior smelled faintly of rose perfume and old leather, a scent that should have been comforting but now made Savannah feel sick. Her wedding dress bunched awkwardly around her legs, the layers of tulle clinging to her thighs like a wet paper towel. She had kicked off her shoes somewhere near the edge of the passenger seat, leaving her toes bare against the mat, which was gritty with roadside dust. Her fingers trembled around the steering wheel, even though she wasn't driving anymore. She had pulled over more than 20 minutes ago, and yet she remained frozen in place, hands locked in that same useless grip, as though if she let go, she might unravel completely. Outside, the clouds pressed low over the trees, and the air was thick with the hush of a storm holding its breath. A few raindrops had begun to strike the windshield, leaving smeared trails that matched the ones on her cheeks. The wipers were broken, just like the tire, and just like everything else that had gone wrong today. Savannah blinked hard and tried to steady her breathing. She hated the sound of her own sobs, hated how small and powerless they made her feel, but she couldn't stop them from clawing their way up from her chest. The tears spilled hot and fast over her skin, washing away flecks of mascara in slow, gritty streams. Her veil had slipped sideways sometime between throwing her bouquet into the back seat and yanking the steering wheel into a hard turn off the interstate. Now it hung limp against her shoulder, like the sail of a boat that had stopped catching wind. A lone earring dangled from her left ear, the other lost on the floor somewhere beneath her gown. Her lipstick, once a careful rosewood red, had bled into the corners of her mouth, leaving her looking more like a startled doll than a bride. The silence in the car was heavy. The radio had stopped working an hour ago, and her phone lay useless on the seat beside her, the battery long dead. She had no charger, no directions, no plan. Just a dying vehicle, a wedding that had burst apart like a popped balloon, and a life that no longer felt like her own. She had fled in a blind haze, barely conscious of where she was going, her only goal to get away. Away from the altar, from the gasps and whispers, from the sight of her mother's face contorting in horror as the truth spilled out in front of all those guests. Savannah had always thought of heartbreak as something soft and melancholy, something that came in waves, but this wasn't a wave. This was a storm surge, and it had pulled her under so fast that her lungs still burned. Her fiancé, not fiancé, not any more had, stood there, barely blinking, as the woman he had been sleeping with for 6 months crashed the ceremony with a baby bump and a voice full of rage. Savannah didn't remember much after that. Only her feet moving, her chest heaving, the sound of someone yelling behind her as she bolted toward the parking lot with her dress trailing behind like a phantom. Now, alone on the side of a narrow road, surrounded by nothing but trees, and quiet, she felt exposed and stupid, a flat tire. Of course, why not? Why shouldn't the universe pile that on? Just one more insult. She hadn't even noticed until the car started thudding, the wheel wobbling beneath her. She had pulled over, half expecting the entire engine to drop out. The pain behind her eyes throbbed like a second heartbeat, and she leaned her forehead against the steering wheel. She didn't want to call anyone. Not her mother, not her sister, not even her best friend who had begged her not to marry him. She didn't want the "I told you so" or the awkward silences or the pity, especially not the pity. She sat like that for what felt like hours, unable to cry anymore but still broken wide open. When she finally lifted her head, the windshield was fogged from her breath, and the last light of day had drained from the sky. The forest around her pulsed with the sounds of dusk-chirping insects, the occasional distant rustle of leaves, and she felt suddenly very far from everything. Far from the church, far from town, far from any version of herself that felt remotely intact. That's when she saw him. He came up the road with slow steps, his silhouette emerging through the fading mist and gathering drizzle. He looked young, maybe 17 or 18, with a backpack slung over one shoulder and soaked curls sticking to his forehead. His jacket was dark and already dripping, the kind of cheap synthetic fabric that did nothing to repel the rain. He didn't walk like a threat. His pace was measured, cautious but not suspicious, and when he stopped beside the driver's side window, he didn't knock or shout. He simply stood there, his expression soft and uncertain. Savannah stared at him, unsure if she should roll the window down or just drive away on the rim of her tire and let fate finish her off. Her hand hovered near the lock, hesitation tightening in her chest like a fist. He wasn't big. He didn't look older than her younger cousin. His jeans were stained with what might have been oil or dirt or both, and there was something almost apologetic in the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot, waiting. Finally, she cracked the window. "I don't need help," she said, but even to her own ears, the words sounded hollow and brittle. The boy didn't flinch. He didn't offer a fake smile or try to sell her something. He just tilted his head slightly and said, "I think your tire might disagree." There was something disarming in his voice. It wasn't overly kind or syrupy, just plain-spoken and sincere. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I don't have anything to pay you," she said after a pause, voice quieter now. "I'm not asking," he replied, glancing toward the flat tire. "I've got tools. If you want, I can take care of it. You don't have to get out or anything." Savannah studied his face. His features were fine but weathered, like someone who had seen more than he should for his age. His eyes, the color of dark honey, held no judgment, only focus. She surprised herself by nodding, then reached across the seat to unlock the passenger door. He didn't speak again as he worked. She watched from inside as he crouched near the wheel, the rain starting to thicken into a steady curtain that made the road shimmer like glass. His movements were practiced and calm. He laid out his tools with the care of someone who valued every piece. Each twist of the lug wrench, each lift of the jack, was deliberate. Savannah found herself watching the curve of his jaw, the way his sleeves clung to his arms, the steam rising from his skin in the wet air. He didn't glance at her, not once, not even when he slipped slightly on the damp shoulder of the road and caught himself with a muttered breath. He just kept working, fixing the thing that had failed her like it was the most normal thing in the world. By the time he finished, the rain had soaked through her open window, dampening the seat beside her. She didn't care. He stood and looked at her, his face rain, slick and unreadable. "You're good to go," he said simply. "Don't drive too far on that spare." She opened her mouth to say thank you, or maybe something else, something bigger, but he had already turned, disappearing down the road the way he came, shoulders hunched slightly forward against the weather. Savannah sat in the quiet again, but now it felt different. The weight on her chest had not disappeared, but it had shifted, just slightly, making room for something else. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked at the rearview mirror. Her reflection stared back, hollow-eyed and rain-smeared, but no longer alone. Not entirely. The first shiver slipped down Jason's spine like an uninvited guest as the rain picked up, soaking through the seams of his jacket and shirt until his skin felt raw beneath the fabric. He crouched by the back tire, the gravel cold and sharp beneath his knees, and reached for the jack he had carried in his backpack for over a year. It wasn't pretty paint chipped, handle stiff from age, but it still worked, and that mattered more than how it looked. He brushed away the wet strands of hair clinging to his forehead and set to work, keeping his eyes low and his hands moving. He didn't want to look up at her. She had already given him a glimpse of the pain she carried in her face, and it had felt too intimate, too much like peeking into someone's diary. His fingers, long and narrow, found the edges of the tire rims slick with road grime. The scent of wet asphalt filled his nose, mixed with the metallic tang of rust and the faint sweetness of wilted flowers drifting from somewhere inside the car. He could hear her breathing. Slow, controlled, but with an edge of unevenness that betrayed the storm inside her. He tightened the bolts in a rhythm, using the full weight of his upper body to wrench them loose one by one, each groaning release a small victory. Rainwater pooled beneath the car, soaking through the knees of his jeans. He didn't care. He had done this 100 times, on his own bike tires, on old beaters at the gas station, once, even for his neighbor's tractor when it had thrown a wheel in a ditch. But this was different. The way she looked at him through the windshield, her wide eyes hollow and red-rimmed, made his hands feel too big, his movements too clumsy. He focused harder, grounding himself in the task. Work was safe. Work was something he understood. When he reached for the spare tire in the trunk, he noticed her bouquet on the floor beside it. The flowers were crushed, a mess of soft petals and broken stems, their once proud colors smeared like bruises. It felt wrong to look at it too long, so he averted his gaze and hoisted the donut spare with a grunt. It was lighter than it should have been, barely adequate for real travel, but it would get her anywhere but here. He worked faster as the wind began to stir, hissing through the trees and tugging at the hem of her dress where it spilled out of the car. The fabric moved like it was alive, twisting and sighing in the rain. He had seen wedding dresses before, on television, in store windows downtown during prom season, but never like this, not ruined, not soaked, not clinging like a second skin to someone whose heart had just cracked open. He wiped his hands on the front of his jeans, leaving dark smears, and stood up slowly. His lower back ached, and his fingers felt stiff from the cold, but the job was done. The spare tire sat snug and ready. He stepped back, rubbing his shoulder absently. Inside the car, she was watching him. Their eyes met through the glass for a long moment, and the stillness between them was almost a physical thing. Jason felt a sudden urge to say something, but nothing came. Not the right thing, anyway. What could he say to a woman in a wedding dress who had fled some kind of disaster, who now sat alone in a car with rain dripping from her lashes and pain etched deep into the corners of her mouth? He took a step away. "You're good to go," he said, raising his voice just enough to carry through the open window. "The spare's on. Should hold until you get to a shop." She blinked, as though waking from a dream. Her fingers, delicate and trembling, clutched the steering wheel with knuckles gone pale. Her voice came out quiet, like a breath swallowed halfway through. I don't have anything to give you," she said. "No money, nothing." Jason shook his head. He shoved his hands into his pockets, mostly to hide how cold they were. "I didn't stop for money." Her mouth opened, then closed. She looked away quickly, brushing a wet curl from her temple. For a moment, he thought she might start crying again, but she held it back, jaw tight. "Thank you," she whispered. Jason nodded. He turned to leave. "Wait," she called softly. He paused, standing just outside the reach of the headlights, his back to her. "What's your name?" she asked. There was something in her voice, fragile but earnest, that made him turn back around. The rain traced silver lines down his face and neck. "Jason." Her lips moved around the name like she was trying to memorize it. Then she nodded once, more to herself than to him, and looked down at her hands. Jason didn't linger. He gave her a final nod and walked back into the misty dark, the sound of his footsteps muffled by wet earth and gravel. The wind pressed against his jacket like invisible hands, pushing him forward, urging him back to the life he had come from. Behind him, the car remained still for a few minutes longer, until finally the engine turned over. He heard it catch, a soft rumble against the quiet hiss of rain, then fade as she pulled away and disappeared down the road. He didn't know where she was going. He didn't know what had happened to her. But something about the way she had looked at him, like he was the first person to see her and not ask questions, stayed with him long after the sound of her tires was gone. As he walked, his jeans clung heavy to his legs, soaked through entirely, and his boots sloshed with each step. The ache in his stomach had returned, deeper now, sharp and twisting. He had no umbrella, no money, and at least an hour of walking ahead of him. But something warm flickered low in his chest, a kind of quiet that came not from exhaustion, but from the knowledge that he had done something that mattered. Not everything in the world could be fixed with a wrench. Not every wound could be bandaged with kindness. But tonight, he had taken something broken and given it just enough care to move again. And for now, that was enough. Savannah barely remembered the drive back. The road was slick and unfamiliar, and the spare tire rumbled beneath her like a protest, humming a constant low warning. Trees blurred past in the rain, their branches heavy and bowed, dripping in long rivulets that reminded her of tears she had no strength left to shed. Her hands shook on the steering wheel, not from fear but from something deeper, a hollow ache that seemed to stretch from the soft spot behind her ribs all the way down to the soles of her feet. The boy Jason he had said was gone, just like that, as if he had never existed, like a mirage on a road swollen with rain and silence. She replayed his face in her mind, trying to remember the curve of his jaw, the way his soaked curls clung to his forehead, the set of his mouth when he worked in the storm with quiet, practiced hands. There had been something steady about him, not confident in the arrogant way of men who tried to impress her, but strong in the way of people who have endured more than they should and have learned how to move forward anyway. She had never met anyone like him. The parking lot outside her friend Miriam's house was mostly empty when she pulled in. Her fingers were stiff from gripping the wheel too tightly for too long, and her back ached from tension. She sat in the car for a full minute before gathering the courage to open the door. Her dress clung to her skin like a second, heavier body. She gathered it in her arms and walked barefoot across the concrete, puddles soaking into her hem, the veil she had forgotten still trailing behind like a ghost of everything that had gone wrong. Inside, Miriam opened the door without a word and wrapped her in a towel so large and warm it felt like a memory. Savannah didn't speak until the next morning. She simply curled on the couch in oversized pajamas and stared at the ceiling while Miriam brought tea in silence in equal measure. It was what she needed. Words would have crumbled her. When morning came, golden and thin like spilled honey through the blinds, Savannah finally sat up. Her body felt sore, not just from the physical ordeal, but from the weight of grief that had pressed down on her like a second atmosphere. She sipped lukewarm coffee and stared at her phone charging beside her. There were dozens of missed calls, messages blinking like warning lights, but she ignored them all. Instead, she searched online for the gas station logo she remembered seeing on Jason's jacket. It was a local chain, a small one, and it took less than an hour to narrow it down. The picture of the station was old and grainy, a squat building with peeling paint and an ancient ice chest out front. She stared at it like it might give her answers. She called. The voice on the other end was gruff, tinged with the static of bad reception. "I'm looking for someone," she said. "I think his name is Jason. He helped me yesterday. He had a backpack and curly hair. He said he worked at one of your stations." The man on the phone snorted, amused. "That sounds like Jason, all right. Scrawny kid. Smart as hell. Works here part-time. You want to leave him a message or something?" "No," she said, and her voice shook with something she hadn't expected. "I want to see him." The man gave her the address without protest. People in small towns didn't ask many questions. She dressed carefully, pulling on jeans and a soft blue sweater, and tucked her hair behind her ears before tying it up loosely. Her heart thudded in her chest like it was too big for her body. It wasn't nerves exactly. It was something more like purpose. The drive to the trailer park took less time than she expected. Rows of faded homes sat in neat but tired lines, their yards overgrown with crabgrass, and the occasional rusted tricycle abandoned beneath the trees. Children's laughter rang faintly from somewhere out of view, but the streets were mostly empty. Savannah parked beneath a crooked tree and stepped out slowly, clutching the envelope tighter in her hand. She had written a note, simple but honest. It was folded neatly around the check inside the envelope. $25,000. The number had made her hands tremble when she wrote it, not because it felt too much, but because it didn't feel enough. She didn't want to insult him. She didn't want him to think she saw him as a charity case. But the image of him soaked and shivering, kneeling in the rain to fix her tire with tools that looked older than he was, haunted her. The trailer was small and pale blue, its metal siding dented and worn smooth at the edges. Wind chimes hung near the door, tinkling gently in the breeze like soft glass laughter. A pair of canvas sneakers sat just outside on the concrete step. She knocked lightly, once, then twice more. The door opened a moment later, revealing a woman who looked too young to be his mother, but with the same tired kindness in her eyes. She wore scrubs patterned with cartoon animals, and her hair was pulled into a bun that had mostly come undone. "Hi," Savannah said, unsure how to begin. "I'm looking for Jason." The woman's expression flickered, then softened. "He's at work. Should be home soon, though. Are you a friend?" "I think so," Savannah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He helped me yesterday. I just wanted to say thank you." The woman stepped aside and gestured for her to come in. The trailer smelled of lemon cleaner and faintly of cinnamon. It was clean but small, the furniture worn and patched in places. Family photos lined the wall. Jason, as a boy, grinning with missing teeth, holding up a fish nearly bigger than he was. She stared at them for a long moment. "I'm his mother," the woman said softly. "I don't know what he did for you, but he's got a good heart, always has." Savannah swallowed, and the envelope in her hand crinkled as her grip tightened. "I want to help him," she said. "He didn't ask for anything. He didn't even wait around long enough to hear me say thank you. But I don't think I can move on from that moment unless I do something." The woman looked at her, eyes narrowing slightly as if she were weighing Savannah's sincerity. Then she nodded and gestured to the table. "Sit," she said. "You can wait here." And so Savannah waited, her heart ticking like a clock inside her chest, watching the door and hoping that the boy who had stepped into her storm like it was nothing would walk through it again and allow her, for just a moment, to give something back. Jason stepped through the front door, with his head bent slightly forward, his jacket dark with sweat at the collar and damp from the long walk home. The smell of metal and gasoline still clung to his skin, buried in the folds of his clothes, carried in his hair like an invisible halo. He kicked his boots off near the threshold with a tired grunt, rubbing the back of his neck with a grimy hand before wiping it absently on his jeans. His muscles ached in a dull, familiar way, the kind of fatigue that lived in the bones and curled into every quiet part of the body once the work was done. He didn't notice her at first. He was halfway to the kitchen when he heard the soft scrape of a chair leg against the linoleum. He froze. His eyes lifted, startled, and there she was. Sitting at the tiny dining table beside his mother, hands folded tightly in her lap, her face pale but steady. Her hair had been brushed out, curling softly around her shoulders, and she wore no makeup now. No veil, no dress, just jeans and a sweater the color of pale sea glass. It made her eyes seem darker, deeper, almost stormy. Savannah. He blinked, unsure whether she was real or some trick of exhaustion. He hadn't said her name aloud since that night, but it had echoed in his mind on every walk home, every moment he had allowed his thoughts to drift. His breath caught somewhere in his throat, and he stood there, unsure what to do with his hands or the sudden racing of his heart. His mother looked between them and stood slowly. "I'm going to take my tea in the bedroom," she said, touching Jason's arm gently as she passed. "You've got company." Jason nodded stiffly. He still hadn't spoken. Savannah rose too, her fingers curled around the edge of the chair for balance, as if the floor beneath her had become suddenly uncertain. "Hi," she said quietly. Jason swallowed. "Hi," he echoed. The silence stretched, not awkward but full, like a pause before the first note of a song. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me," she said, her voice more composed than he expected. He shook his head. "No, it's not that. I didn't expect you." She stepped forward and held something out to him. A plain, white envelope, creased slightly along the edges where her fingers had pressed it too tightly. Jason glanced at it, then back at her. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "You didn't let me that night. You just left." He shrugged, rubbing a hand through his curls. "Didn't think you needed more than a fixed tire." Her lips pressed together in a small, unreadable smile. "Well, I needed more than I thought, but that's not the point. Open it." Jason took the envelope, hesitant, and peeled it open slowly. Inside was a check, a real one. His eyes scanned the number once, then again, disbelieving. $25,000. His mouth opened, but no sound came. He looked up at her, eyes wide and questioning. "It's not charity," she said quickly, her voice threading through his disbelief like a lifeline. "It's not guilt either. I'm not trying to buy anything. You showed up on one of the worst days of my life and treated me like a person when I didn't even feel human. You helped me without asking who I was or what I could give. You didn't try to fix more than the tire. You just did what you could, and that meant everything." Jason stared down at the paper, heart pounding so hard he felt it in his fingertips. The ink shimmered slightly under the light, real and impossible. "I can't take this," he said, but it sounded weak even to his own ears. "You can," she replied. "And you will. Because it's not a gift, Jason. It's a spark. You said you wanted to be a mechanic. I asked around. You want to go to trade school. I talked to my father. He owns a chain of repair shops across the state. He gave me this to give to you." She reached into her pocket and handed him a business card. It was thick and embossed, the kind that meant something to people who cared about appearances. Jason held it delicately between his fingers like it might dissolve if he gripped it too hard. "He said if you're half as good as I said you are, he'll find you a spot to train on weekends. School during the week, work when you can handle it. No strings, no catch." Jason's chest felt too tight, like the walls of the room were pushing in on him. He stepped back and leaned against the kitchen counter, gripping the edge until his knuckles turned white. "You don't even know me," he said, his voice cracking with something he hadn't meant to reveal. "I know enough," she said, stepping closer. "I know you didn't think twice about helping me, even though you had nothing. I know you walk home in the rain and carry your tools in a backpack. I know your mother speaks about you like the sun rises because you get up every day." His eyes burned suddenly, and he blinked hard, looking down at the floor. Her voice was gentle but sure, each word sliding beneath his skin and rooting itself there. "I'm not trying to save you," she said. "You don't need saving. I just want to see what happens when someone finally gives you a chance." He looked up again, and there was no pity in her expression, just hope and belief, and something soft and shining behind her eyes that felt like forgiveness, not of him, but of the world. Jason exhaled, long and slow, like he was letting go of a weight he had carried for years. He folded the check carefully and slid it back into the envelope. Then he looked at her and nodded. "Okay," he said. "I'll take it, but I'm going to earn every cent." Her smile widened then, the first real one he had seen from her, and it lit her face like the first dry light after days of rain. "I know you will," she said. They stood there, in the soft quiet of the kitchen, the sound of the wind outside brushing through the leaves like a secret shared between old friends. And in that small, warm space, something shifted. Not everything was fixed, not everything was healed, but something had started. A door opened, a fuse lit, and for the first time in a very long while, Jason allowed himself to imagine a future that looked different from the past. A life that didn't end with rusted tools and tired walks home. A path he could choose for himself, beginning with the single, quiet miracle of being seen. Jason pressed the sole of his boot against the garage floor and pushed the creeper out from beneath the car. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, casting a pale sheen on the underside of the chassis he had just finished tightening. His hands were blackened to the wrists with grease and oil, the tips of his fingers chapped from cold mornings and hours spent gripping tools. He sat up slowly, bones stiff from the cramped position, and looked across the garage. The air smelled of hot rubber, motor oil, and the faint bite of acetone drifting from the paint booth in the far corner. It had been 6 months since Savannah had handed him the envelope with the check and the future folded neatly inside. He had stared at it every night for the first week as if it might vanish in his sleep. He waited for the catch, for something to go wrong, but nothing ever did. The money had gone toward tuition first, then a new set of tools. The rest sat in a savings account, untouched. Just knowing it was there gave him a quiet confidence, like a foundation beneath his feet. He started classes at the technical college 3 weeks after that night in the kitchen. He took the early morning bus in before dawn and the late-night bus home. He worked weekends and afternoons at the shop Savannah's father had assigned him to, a squat concrete building off the interstate just outside the city. It was nothing fancy, but it was steady, and the people were kind. The manager, Vince, had bushy gray eyebrows and a voice like a busted muffler, but he treated Jason like an apprentice, not an errand boy. He let him watch, ask questions, and eventually handed him real jobs. Jason learned the rhythm of the place quickly, the hiss of the air compressor in the mornings, the sharp rattle of impact wrenches during tire swaps, the slow, deliberate music of socket sets sliding into place. He learned how to flush a radiator without making a mess, how to coax a stubborn serpentine belt into compliance, how to listen not just with his ears but with his hands and his gut. Engines spoke in ticks and groans and vibrations, and Jason began to understand their language. He was a natural, or so everyone said. But Jason didn't care much for praise. He measured his days in engines repaired, in customers who drove away smiling. He liked knowing he had fixed something, even if it wasn't permanent, even if it might break again. There was power in that moment of return, in taking something that faltered and making it run clean and smooth. The garage door creaked open as the afternoon sunlight slanted in. Jason turned, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his back pocket. Savannah stepped inside, ducking beneath the low doorframe, her presence bright even beneath the grime and noise of the workshop. She wore a denim jacket and black jeans, her hair pulled back into a loose braid. She always looked slightly out of place here, like she belonged in a quieter world, but she never seemed uncomfortable. Jason grinned. He didn't mean to. It just happened whenever he saw her. "You're early," he said, tossing the rag onto his tool cart. "Your mom said you finished class early today," she replied, walking over and handing him a paper cup. Coffee, the good kind, still warm. Jason took it gratefully. The cup warmed his hands and chased away the lingering chill from the garage. They sat together on the curb just outside, the scent of gasoline and flowering grass mixing on the wind. Savannah tucked her knees up beneath her and leaned against the wall, her eyes half-lidded in the sun. She had been visiting more lately. At first, it was just to check in, to see how school was going, how the job was treating him. But then they started sharing dinners in the city, long walks between her classes and his shifts, and soft conversations that unfolded over the buzz of neon signs and flickering streetlights. He never asked about the wedding, about the man or the chaos she had fled. She never brought it up either. It sat between them in silence, not heavy, not painful, but like an old book neither of them needed to open. They had found something new in each other, something they were still figuring out, but it was quiet and real, and Jason had learned not to question things that brought him peace. Savannah sipped her drink and turned to him, her voice soft. "Vince says you fixed that transmission in under 4 hours." Jason chuckled, scratching behind his ear. "Lucky guess." "No, that's skill," she said. "He's impressed. My dad, too." Jason looked down at his boots. The leather was scuffed, toes worn smooth from months of kneeling on concrete. He wiggled them idly against the gravel. "It's just a job," he said, though part of him didn't believe it. "No," she said, and her voice had that certainty that always made him pause. "It's a beginning." He glanced up at her. Her expression was thoughtful, not glowing or romantic, just full of quiet pride. "I keep thinking about that night," she said, her gaze fixed on some invisible point in the distance. "You, in the rain, not saying much, just working. I'd been surrounded by people for months who talked too much and did too little. You didn't say anything you didn't mean. You didn't ask me anything I couldn't give. I still think about that." Jason took a sip of his coffee and let the warmth fill his mouth before he replied. "I didn't know what to say. I just knew you needed the car to work." She smiled, small and soft. "Yeah, but more than that, I needed someone to see me. And you did, without trying." The silence between them thickened, but it was a good kind, like heavy wool on a winter evening. He reached over and brushed a strand of hair from her face. She let him. "I'm trying to do something with all of this," he said after a while. "The money, the job. It's not just for me." "I know," she said. Jason looked past her at the city skyline, beginning to blink to life in the distance. The sky was dipped in gold, clouds rimmed with lavender. He felt full in a way he had never known before, like the world was finally giving something back. "I want to help people like me," he said. "Kids who don't think they can get out, who don't have someone like you showing up with an envelope and a lifeline." Savannah leaned her head on his shoulder. Her voice was barely audible. "Then do it," she said. "And I'll help however I can." Jason closed his eyes. The scent of oil and rain still clung to his skin, but now it mingled with the fragrance of her hair and the distant hum of possibility. His world had once been made of rust and scarcity. Now it was expanding. One bolt, one ride, one quiet moment at a time. And somehow, in all that motion, in the clang of hammers and the whirl of gears, he had found something steady, someone steady. The girl in the wedding dress he had saved on the road had come back not to be rescued, but to remind him he could build more than just engines. He could build a life. And he was, one turn at a time. The morning was already warm by the time Jason rolled the garage door open. Sunlight pooled across the concrete like honey, slow and golden, painting the dust motes in lazy spirals. The van sat in the center of it all, a dented white thing with patches of primer gray and a long scar along its left panel. He had found it through a friend of Vince's, some old fleet vehicle that hadn't run in years. When he first saw it, the engine was wheezing like a winded animal, and the interior reeked of mildew and lost time. Most people would have walked away. Jason saw something else. Now the van stood taller, cleaner, still imperfect but humming with new life. The engine purred with a low, steady thrum, belts snug and wires clean, the kind of quiet pride only hours of deliberate labor could create. The name he had painted on the side with a borrowed stencil was simple: Hands On. Below it, in smaller letters, was the phrase that mattered more to him than anything else: No charge for single moms and elders. We come to you. He hadn't told many people about the idea. Savannah, of course. She had helped him write the flyer, printing it on recycled cardstock in a dusty corner of the university library. He had pinned it on bulletin boards across town, tucked it under wiper blades, handed it to anyone who looked like they might be carrying more than they let on. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't meant to be. But within weeks, the calls started coming. The first was a woman with 3 kids and a sedan that wouldn't start in her driveway. Jason arrived in the fading blue of dusk, tools in hand, and his name stitched in fading thread on his jumpsuit. The youngest child had peeked out from the doorway with wide eyes as Jason knelt on the driveway and opened the hood. By the time he had the car running again, the mother's eyes were glassy, and she held a plastic container of lasagna out to him with shaking hands. "For your dinner," she whispered. "You don't know what this means." Jason had eaten it cold in the front seat of the van, the smell of garlic and warmth lingering in the cab like comfort itself. That night, he couldn't sleep. Not from worry, but from the quiet electricity of knowing he had done something that mattered. The stories kept coming. A grandfather with a rusted pickup that hadn't moved in months. A teenager whose car broke down the day before her job interview. A woman whose brakes screamed every time she touched the pedal but who couldn't miss another shift at the diner. Jason drove to them all, tools rattling in the back, shoulders aching but spirit unshakable. Every repair was a conversation. A story exchanged beneath the curve of an open hood or beside a sagging tire. He kept a notebook on the dashboard. Inside, he scribbled names and dates, small notes to remind himself who he had helped and what their laughter had sounded like when they turned the key and the engine started. He didn't charge them. Not because he didn't need the money, he always needed the money, but because the point wasn't the transaction. It was the connection, the gesture, the proof that someone still showed up, even when no one else would. News of his mobile garage spread slowly at first, carried by word of mouth through church bulletins, whispered at food banks, mentioned on the sidelines of youth soccer games. Then one morning, a local reporter from the weekly paper followed a neighbor's tip and knocked on the garage door. He was a short man, with a camera slung around his neck and a notepad tucked into his back pocket. He asked if he could ride along for the day, just to watch. Jason didn't think twice. He let the man climb into the passenger seat and watched in amusement as he scribbled furiously during each repair, nodding and muttering to himself. The article ran the next Thursday under the headline, "Teen Mechanic Fixes More Than Cars." There was a photo of Jason beneath the van, light catching the curve of his jaw and the gleam of a wrench. The story told of his humble beginnings, the moment in the rain with a crying bride, and the mobile van now serving the people most often overlooked. By Friday morning, his phone wouldn't stop ringing. A woman from a nonprofit offered him supplies. A retired mechanic dropped off a box of old tools, each one polished and labeled like a gift. Someone from a television station called and left a message. Jason didn't return that one. He didn't want cameras in people's driveways or boom mics dangling over women with tired eyes and quiet pride. He just wanted to keep going. He expanded slowly, not with ambition, but with care. He trained a friend from class who had grown up fixing things, too, who knew what it meant to stretch $10 across 3 dinners. Together they worked side by side, van doors swinging open like an invitation, music drifting from the radio, the smell of motor oil, a kind of anthem. Savannah rode with him sometimes. She never got in the way, just sat with a notepad and helped organize requests, brought coffee, read to him while he soldered or replaced brake pads. Her voice always calmed him. Sometimes, when the day grew long and their hands were black with grease, she would lean over and kiss his cheek, a gesture that landed quiet and steady, the way leaves fall from trees in the last days of autumn. At night, Jason would sit on the porch steps of the trailer, the van parked just beyond the gravel path, and watch the stars breathe in the darkness. The world still held hardship. Rent still came due. Some engines refused to run no matter how gently he coaxed them. But in that wide, starlit silence, he felt rooted. The kind of steady that only comes from knowing you are exactly where you're meant to be. He thought sometimes of the day he met Savannah, how her veil had hung limp like a surrender flag, and how he had walked away not expecting to see her again. He wondered how many lives turned on small, quiet hinges. A flat tire, a knock on the window, a boy with a wrench. And now, a van rolling through forgotten streets with its side panel painted by hand, letters just slightly uneven but impossible to miss. Hands on. No charge. We come to you. It was more than a slogan, it was a promise, one he had every intention of keeping. The gravel crunched beneath the tires as Savannah stepped out of the cab and let the door swing shut behind her. She blinked against the bright morning sun, her suitcase trailing behind her, one of its tiny wheels squeaking in protest over the uneven stones. Jason looked up from the workbench, a socket wrench still in his hand, and for a second his face did not register the change. He blinked, then stood slowly, a streak of oil stretching across his forearm like a smudge of war paint. She looked different, not dramatic, not showy, just more settled. Her hair was pulled into a messy knot, wisps curling loose around her neck. She wore a pale cotton blouse, tucked into high-waisted jeans that bore the dust of travel, and sneakers with scuffed soles. Her suitcase was small, but its presence was unmistakable. She wasn't just visiting this time. Jason wiped his hands on a cloth and walked toward her with deliberate steps, slow but certain, as if his body understood something his mind had not yet caught up to. They met near the edge of the garage, where the sun melted into the shade of the overhang. For a moment they stood in silence, watching each other. The breeze fluttered the hem of her shirt and sent a soft rustling through the nearby trees. "I didn't know you were coming," he said, his voice rough, from a morning already filled with engine noise and coffee. "I didn't really decide until I was halfway here," Savannah replied, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "But I'm not going back." Jason's chest rose slowly, then fell. He nodded once, then reached for the handle of her suitcase. She let him take it, their fingers brushing for a brief second that sparked something soft between them. He set it just inside the garage and turned back to face her. "Everything okay?" he asked. Savannah's eyes softened, but they didn't drop. "It is now. I thought I needed more time to figure everything out, but I realized I already had." Jason opened his mouth to reply, but she stepped closer, placing a hand gently on his chest, right over where his heart beat steady and slow beneath the fabric. Her fingers lingered there, warm and confident, and Jason felt a part of him unfold that he hadn't known was still closed. "I was thinking," she said, "maybe we could take the van on the road, visit some of the towns farther out, the ones where no one's fixed a car in months because the nearest shop's an hour away and no one can afford the tow." Jason studied her face. There was a brightness there, not loud or demanding, but the kind that glowed beneath the skin like a coal. She had found herself again. He could see it in the way she stood, weight even on both feet, shoulders relaxed but certain. He nodded, already imagining the route in his mind, the roads that twisted through hills and farmland, the scattered towns with rusted signs and broken fences. "Yeah," he said, "we could do that." They spent the next week preparing. Jason tuned the van with fresh filters and checked the brakes twice. Savannah organized the route, pinning notes to the wall in his bedroom with names of towns she'd heard about through her father's network or whispers at food pantries. They loaded the van with tools, parts, food, a cooler with water bottles, and a box of flyers printed with their mission in bold, clean letters. They left before sunrise. The sky was still a dark, rich blue, scattered with the last stars of night as the van rolled out of the driveway. Savannah rode shotgun, feet tucked beneath her, a thermos balanced between her knees. Jason drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting casually near the gear shift, fingers drumming in rhythm with the soft hum of the tires. The city shrank behind them, replaced by fields of golden weeds and barns slouched with age. The air smelled different out here, crisp with dew and the sharp edge of cut grass. They stopped in towns with names Jason could barely pronounce. In some places, the gas stations had closed years ago, and the only store left sold milk, dog food, and postcards covered in dust. People greeted them with suspicion at first, their eyes narrowing as they stepped out of the van. But Jason's voice, quiet and respectful, combined with Savannah's calm presence, disarmed them. He would ask about their car, about the noises it made, or the way the steering wheel pulled too hard to the left, and then he would get to work. Savannah waited nearby, sometimes helping, sometimes sitting with the owner, sharing stories over folding chairs and styrofoam cups of lemonade. Children gravitated to her like moths to a lantern, her laugh easy and full as she listened to their stories or let them peek inside the toolboxes. In one town, a boy no older than 8 handed Jason a drawing he had made, crayon on wrinkled paper. The van was there, clumsily sketched with big wheels and smoke puffing from the tailpipe. Jason was stick-thin and grinning, with black smudges drawn across his face. Savannah stood beside him with a crown. Above them, the boy had written, "Thank you for fixing our world." Jason kept that drawing folded in the glove box, pressed between receipts and work orders. At night, they parked in quiet places, church parking lots, the backyards of grateful families, the edges of fields where fireflies blinked like Morse code. They would sit on the roof of the van, legs dangling over the side, wrapped in a blanket and the hush of summer air. The sky stretched wide above them, impossibly black and thick with stars. One night, as the fireflies danced below and the wind rolled through the grass, Savannah leaned her head on Jason's shoulder. "Do you ever think," she said, her voice low, "that maybe all this happened exactly the way it needed to?" Jason thought of the rain that had soaked him through the night they met, the silence in her car, the tire, the wrench, the way she had looked at him through fogged glass. "Yeah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I do." She turned her face up toward his, her eyes soft in the starlight. Her fingers slipped into his, warm and sure, and the quiet settled over them like a blanket. There were still many roads ahead, many engines to fix, many hands to hold, and hearts to mend in the quiet, unnoticed corners of the world. But for now, in that moment, they simply sat together at the edge of everything, and it was enough. The shop stood at the corner of Pine and Laurel, nestled between a shuttered laundromat and an old diner with sun-faded menus taped to the windows. The building was nothing special. Cinder-block walls painted a dull beige with a rusted metal awning that rattled whenever the wind blew just right. The lot was cracked and veined with weeds, but to Jason, it was perfect. It was solid. It was his. The inside smelled like potential. That blend of sawdust, rubber, and cool cement, all anchored by the sweet bite of motor oil, soaked deep into the bones of the building. Sunlight streamed through tall windows along the back wall, casting golden rectangles across the floor. The garage bay doors were open, spilling warmth and late-morning breeze into the space. His new toolboxes sat in a line against the far wall, their drawers full and gleaming. A second lift had just been installed that week, and Jason had spent half the night walking around it, running his fingers along the smooth steel like a boy in awe of a spaceship. Savannah watched him from the front counter, a clipboard in one hand, her glasses slipping slightly down the bridge of her nose. She had brought in an old rug and a pot of ivy to warm up the front office. She claimed it gave the place a little soul. Jason thought she gave it more than that. He could hardly believe how far they had come. Only a year ago, he had been hunched beside the road in the rain, turning lug nuts with frozen fingers. Now he stood at the center of his own shop, the sign above the front door freshly painted and proud. Second Chances Auto, and just beneath it, in thinner script, powered by kindness. It had been Savannah's suggestion. He remembered her smiling when she said it, leaning back on the tailgate of the van, her face lit by the glow of a bonfire. She had explained how people remember stories more than names, and how kindness, if you're lucky, can become contagious. He hadn't argued. The opening ceremony wasn't elaborate. They didn't want streamers or speeches or forced handshakes from local politicians. Instead, they opened the doors early that Friday morning and let the town come to them. Word had spread slowly over the past month. Jason had passed out flyers in every corner of the city, tucking them under windshields, handing them to waitresses, pinning them on bulletin boards at food banks and halfway houses. He spoke to people with nervous hands and tired eyes, people who flinched when he said the word free, who didn't believe at first that someone wanted to help without asking for anything back. But when they came, he didn't turn them away. No matter the rust, the dents, the engines that had been wheezing for months, he took each one in with the same quiet care. He offered rides home when the repairs took more than a day. He let kids sit behind the wheel while he explained how spark plugs worked. He made repairs and coffee in the same breath, offering both without ceremony. By mid-morning on the first day, the waiting area was full. A teenage girl curled into the corner seat with a book clutched to her chest. An older man with calloused hands and faded tattoos sat silently beside her, rubbing the rim of his coffee cup. A young mother rocked a sleeping baby against her shoulder, her purse unzipped and overflowing with half-folded diapers and receipts. Jason moved between the bays with grease on his knuckles and a steady light in his eyes. He greeted every customer like a neighbor. He treated every car like it mattered. Savannah manned the front, keeping track of names and keys and invoices that totaled to zero. She smiled at each person who stepped through the door like they were exactly who she had been waiting for. The pot of ivy on the counter leaned toward the light, and the bell above the door chimed like a heartbeat every time someone entered. Jason's mother arrived just after lunch, her scrubs still creased from her shift at the hospital. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, her eyes wide and wet, taking it all in. He walked to her, wiping his hands on a cloth, and she pulled him into a hug that smelled like lavender and lemon cleaner. She whispered something into his shoulder that he didn't quite catch, but he didn't need to. He felt it in the way she held him. Later that afternoon, Savannah's father showed up in a dark blue pickup, stepping out with a posture that spoke of years building something from nothing. He walked the length of the shop slowly, taking in the layout, the tools, the bustle. He didn't say much at first, just nodded, once, a gesture filled with quiet approval. He shook Jason's hand and clapped him on the shoulder. Then he turned to Savannah and smiled in a way that softened the edges of his usually stoic face. Jason's favorite moment came just before sunset. A little boy, no more than 5, wandered into the garage with a toy car clutched in both hands. His mother called from the doorway, her voice apologetic, but Jason crouched down and waved the boy over. The child's hands were sticky with candy, and his toy car was missing a wheel. Jason took it gently, examined it like a treasure, and pulled a small plastic tire from a drawer near his bench. It didn't match, but it fit. The boy grinned with all his baby teeth showing, and Jason watched him race the car across the floor with a laugh that rang louder than any engine. As the last light of day poured through the open garage doors, painting the cement floor gold, Jason sat on the hood of a car and looked out across the street. Savannah stood beside him, sipping from a bottle of water, her shoulder warm where it brushed his. They watched the sun dip below the rooftops, the trees swaying gently in the evening breeze. "You did it," she said softly. Jason shook his head, smiling as he looked at her. "No," he said, "we did." She leaned her head against his arm, and he closed his eyes for a moment, letting the quiet wrap around them. The shop would close soon. Tomorrow would bring more cars, more names, more stories. There would be broken engines, long days, mistakes made and lessons learned. But tonight, the air was sweet and full of promise. The past felt like a worn-out engine finally given rest, and the future hummed with the steady rhythm of wheels turning toward something new. Jason exhaled, long and deep, and let the weight of gratitude settle in his chest like an anchor. He had built something. With his hands, his sweat, and the quiet strength that had carried him through every storm, and at last he knew it would hold. The summer air drifted in slow and sweet, thick with the scent of cut grass and the faint tang of engine oil that lingered in the corners of the shop like a familiar ghost. Crickets buzzed in the tall grass behind the lot, their chorus rising with the warmth that clung to the early evening. Inside the bay, Jason moved with practiced ease, his hands steady, his shirt damp at the back from hours beneath the heat of the overhead lamps. His fingers traced the curve of the fan belt with a kind of intimate precision that came from knowing the language of machines. He did not have to think anymore. His hands spoke for him. Outside, the sun slipped lower, setting the edges of the garage door aglow. Savannah leaned against the frame, arms crossed, her silhouette outlined in amber light. She wore her hair loose, the strands catching the wind as if reaching for something unseen. Her eyes followed him, quiet and observant, full of that same calm gravity that had settled over her since the day she arrived, with a suitcase and a heart still piecing itself together. Jason stood upright, stretching the stiffness from his back. He pulled the rag from his pocket and wiped the sweat from his brow, then caught her gaze and gave her a small, crooked smile. "You done for the day?" she asked, pushing off from the frame and stepping into the bay, her boots clicking softly on the stained concrete. "Almost," he said, tossing the rag onto the bench. "Just tuning up Mrs. Gaines's Buick. She says it squeals in the mornings." "Probably the belt," Savannah murmured, stepping closer. "You already checked the pulleys?" He looked at her with amusement. "Since when did you become the shop whisperer? I live with you. I've picked up a thing or two," she said, lifting one eyebrow. Jason reached for her hand, fingers brushing along hers before intertwining. The weight of her touch grounded him, soft and steady. She smelled like warm linen and orange peel, familiar and clean. It amazed him how normal it had become, this quiet intimacy, and yet it never lost its shimmer. They stood there together, wrapped in the fading light, the shop around them humming with the hush of a day nearly done. Tools glinted on the pegboard. The radio played low from the front desk, some old soul song drifting like a lullaby. A single moth fluttered against the window pane, its wings casting shifting shadows across the workbench. Jason took a deep breath, inhaling the familiar scent of oil and steel, tinged now with something softer. This place, this shop, had become more than a dream. It had become a heart. It beat with the stories of every person who walked through the door, broken and hoping, tired and waiting. They didn't come just for repairs. They came to be heard. And Jason, somehow, had learned how to listen. He remembered them all. The single father who had driven 2 towns over with a cracked radiator and 2 kids asleep in the back seat. The elderly woman with trembling hands who brought in her husband's truck 3 years after he passed, needing help to keep it running because she still drove it every Sunday to visit his grave. The teenager who showed up with a muffler held in place by zip ties and tape, who left 2 hours later with a safe ride and a shy promise to come back and learn how to do it himself. Each of them had left something behind: a story, a laugh, a thank you scrawled in messy handwriting on a notepad near the register. Jason had saved them all. He kept them in a drawer marked miscellaneous, though he knew they were anything but. Savannah glanced over at the wall, where the shop's sign hung just above the door: Second Chances Auto. The letters were hand-painted, slightly uneven, but proud. Below, the words still read, "Powered by kindness." "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked, her voice just above a whisper. Jason didn't need to ask which one. "All the time," he said, gently pulling her closer. "It doesn't feel real sometimes. You in that dress, me with my busted wrench, the rain, your face." "I was a mess," she said, resting her head against his chest. "You were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen," he murmured, pressing his lips to her hair. She smiled against him, a soft exhale that warmed the space between them. "I used to think that day ruined my life," she said, "that it shattered everything I thought I knew. But now I think it just cracked the glass so I could finally see through it." Jason tilted her chin up gently so their eyes met. "You fixed more than a car that night," she said. "You fixed something in me." He kissed her then, slow and certain, like turning a key in a lock that had waited too long to be opened. The bell above the front door jingled faintly, the familiar sound like a punctuation mark to their silence. Jason pulled back, still close, still holding her, and smiled. "Sounds like someone needs a tune-up," he said. "Or maybe just a place to feel human again," Savannah replied. They walked to the front together, hand in hand, sunlight chasing their shadows across the shop floor. Outside, the sky had turned the color of ripe peaches, streaked with lavender clouds. A light breeze stirred the ivy by the front desk, and the air buzzed with the electricity of dusk. The sign above the door caught the last rays of light, glowing softly in the fading day. It would all begin again tomorrow. New stories, new repairs, more hands reaching out in hope. And they would be here, side by side, ready to meet each one with open hearts and tools in hand. Because kindness, when wielded with care, had the power to rebuild more than engines. It could rebuild people. It could build a life. And here, at the corner of Pine and Laurel, under a modest awning in the watchful eye of the stars, one such life had taken root. It had started with a flat tire and a stranger in a soaked wedding dress. And it had become a future made not of luck, but of choice. A choice to stop. A choice to help. A choice to love. Jason turned the sign to closed. He slipped the key into his pocket and stepped back into the light. Home, after all, was not always a place. Sometimes it was a promise.